Imagine this: 540 soldiers trapped, pinned by relentless enemy fire, surrounded on all sides. Ammunition dwindling, the cries for help silenced by static, and command already tallying the lost. Every procedure screamed, "Stand down." Every doctrine demanded, "Wait." But what if one ignored pilot, dismissed as a ghost in the system, refused to let a battalion die? The metallic tang of dust settled heavy on the air, mingling with the distant, rhythmic thrum of generators. Inside the utilitarian structure that served as a mess hall, the scrape of trays against steel rails and the low murmur of voices formed a constant backdrop. But amidst the transient camaraderie, one figure sat deliberately apart, legs crossed on a worn tarp. Captain Valerius, known by her squadron as Ghost Talon, sat with a flight helmet resting beside her, a battered kneeboard on her lap. Her movements, even in repose, held a precision, an unhurried steadiness that set her apart. Barely 5 feet tall, she seemed to inhabit her space with a quiet intensity, her focus drawn inward. While others traded boasts and laughter, she traced lines on her kneeboard, scribbling notes on weapon system displays, refining trim settings, her world a tapestry of calibration and calculation. Her A-10, the Warthog, wasn't merely an aircraft. It was an extension of this focus. Every nuance, every potential response was logged like scripture in her meticulous hand. Cannon harmonics at various speeds, pylon loadouts, the unique recoil patterns of the GAU-8, how its formidable weapon system breathed in the arid heat of the Xylos Badlands. 2 junior technicians ambled past, their voices cutting through the hum. "There's the quota pilot," one muttered, loud enough to land. "Paper wings," the other snorted, a dismissive laugh following. "Lucky cardboard doesn't pull triggers." They didn't slow. They didn't expect a reply. Valerius didn't flinch, her gaze locked on a checklist, adding another line, having heard it all before. Dead weight. Mascot. Check the box, pilot. Too quiet. Too different. Even hardened crew chiefs, seasoned by multiple deployments, still shrugged her off as an administrative asset. "Ghost Talon's fine for simulator work," one had advised the operations officer. "Keep her on comms. Let her handle the logistics." And so they did. Supply runs, radio checks. Nobody sent her to the front lines. Nobody asked her to bring the Warthog's teeth to real fights. Her domain, they implied, was strictly on the ground. What they failed to grasp, because they never bothered to look beyond their preconceived notions, was that Valerius had constructed her own private flight program in the stark solitude of long nights. While others sought camaraderie in the smoke pits, she would unfurl sectional charts under the crimson glow of a red lens flashlight, committing every ridge, every canyon cut of the Xylos Badlands to memory until the map lived in her mind. She charted wind shifts and rotor currents, noting how gusts changed at different times of day across the treacherous valleys. Hour after hour, she ran simulated gun runs and dry fire drills in the simulator, her inputs becoming as steady and reliable as a metronome. And in that unassuming green kneeboard, which might have been mistaken for a grocery list, she recorded it all. Weapon employment tables, fuel burn calculations painstakingly worked by hand for when avionics inevitably failed. Each page filled with neat handwriting, rows of numbers, arrows across grids, her private doctrine, unseen by those convinced she possessed none. Hidden beneath her flight sleeve, a small tattoo of pilot wings cradled a tiny warthog silhouette. It was a mark of precision and relentless effort, earned at a training academy that punished hesitation and demanded perfection. But here, in the harsh glare of the forward operating base, she kept that sleeve low. No need to remind men already certain she didn't belong. This was Valerius's paradox. She never flared when mocked, never argued when dismissed. She carried the insults with the same quiet, careful patience with which she handled her aircraft checklists. She was waiting, not for permission, but for the inevitable moment when all her charts, all her numbers, all her rigid discipline would cease to be invisible. Her story didn't begin under the parched skies of the Xylos Badlands. It began in the dusty flatlands of Redcliffe, where evenings smelled of sun-baked earth and mesquite. Her father, a Marine whose career ended prematurely due to injuries, raised her with a core discipline, even when hundreds of miles separated them. Chores before dawn, fence repairs before breakfast, and at dusk he'd line soda cans on posts, handing her a battered hunting rifle. "Steady breath," he'd say, his voice a low rumble. "Ease the trigger. Let the shot surprise you." By 12, she could systematically clear every can at 50 yards. By 16, she outshot most of the local hunters. Her father, a man of few words, communicated his pride through the quiet intensity in his eyes. When he passed during her senior year, Valerius enlisted, partly to honor his legacy, and partly to prove she could carry the immutable principles he had etched into her bones. She carried that discipline into aviation training, earning a Warthog slot, an achievement few managed and even fewer received proper acknowledgement for. But in the field, paper credentials often meant little against opinions already cast in stone. So she brought her knee board to the flight line and her notebooks back to the bunk, enduring whispers while others flaunted swagger. The compound itself was a bubble of stark routine. Patrols rolled out. Reports trickled back. Soldiers lined up for chow. Briefings recycled the same clipped, uninspired lines. And Valerius drifted at the edges of it all, noticed, but never truly valued. Then the orders came. A battalion, 540 strong, including attachments, was tasked to sweep Serpent's Gulch, a valley intelligence claimed was lightly defended. On paper it looked routine. Secure, clear, stabilize. Maps showed open stretches, direct approaches. Colonel Thorne, leading the session, sold it as simple. Sitting in the back, notebook balanced on her thigh, Valerius read the terrain differently. The contour lines screamed danger. Tight approaches, high ground on 3 sides, kill zones waiting to erupt. She raised her hand, steady as ever. "Sir, have we considered this valley could be a deliberate trap? These folds here," she asked, pointing at the holographic projection. "They could conceal a strong enemy force. It looks too neat." Colonel Thorne barely glanced up. "Captain, track equipment, not strategy. That's above your grade." Chuckles rippled through the room. "Deadweight pilot talking tactics," someone muttered, just loud enough. Valerius quietly shut her notebook, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. She stayed silent. When the briefing concluded, soldiers slung rifles, adjusted helmets, and joked about how quick the sweep would be. From the back, Valerius watched them gear up, board transports, and roll toward the valley's mouth. 540 strong, moving by doctrine, brimming with confidence, untouched by doubt. She remained behind, once more assigned to support duty. Her task? Monitor comms, track supply runs, stay clear of operations. That's all she was told, all she'd been conditioned to accept. But as the distant dust plume of the departing battalion began to shrink on the horizon, leaving only a shimmering heat haze in its wake, Valerius felt the chilling weight of every line she'd traced under red light, every figure she'd logged in her notes. She had envisioned this valley long before the orders dropped, pictured exactly how it could close like a fist. And now, with 540 souls driving into its jaws, she was sidelined. The distant dust plume of the deploying battalion shrank on the horizon, leaving Valerius with a growing sense of dread about the trap she predicted. The next morning, the briefing room still hummed with a forced bravado, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and unaddressed tension. Maps glowed on screens, their contour lines stark and unforgiving. Colonel Thorne, his face a mask of official confidence, dragged a red dot across the digital terrain. Ridges and routes appeared clean on the screen, but Valerius knew the brutal reality they represented. When he paused for questions, a momentary silence fell, broken only by the hum of the projector. Valerius, her hand rising with the same unwavering steadiness she used at her flight controls, broke the hush. "Sir, this valley is a trap," she stated, her voice even, devoid of emotion. "These folds form intersecting fields of fire. Machine guns on the spurs, RPG teams in the draw. Our convoys will be pinned inside a bowl." He didn't follow her pointer. He simply glanced at her name tape, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Captain, you're here to carry radios, not hand out strategy." Laughter stirred again, a ripple of condescension. A private mimed scribbling notes and winked at his buddy. Valerius's fingers pressed tight around the cardboard back of her kneeboard, then eased open, a silent act of restraint. Colonel Thorne clicked forward, the red light wiping her from the frame, her warnings dismissed, ignored. On the flight line, crosswinds slid left to right, just enough to challenge the most seasoned pilot. Valerius strapped into her A-10, narrowing her world to the reticle and the raw, untamed heat of the engines. She dialed her weapon's dope, inhaled deeply, then exhaled slowly. The GAU-8 barked, a steady, merciless rhythm of controlled power. "Look," a young private muttered, watching steel targets jump and collapse downrange. A grizzled gunnery sergeant spat into the dust. "Pylons don't scream back," he drawled, his voice thick with disdain. Valerius logged each burst by habit. Distance, wind, hold, impact, then stripped her data to 0, offering no defense. Later, in the mess hall, trays squealed along rails. Valerius sat alone. 4 soldiers across from her rose as one, scraping chairs as they shifted to another table. "Mascot with a cockpit," one muttered, his voice loud enough to carry, devoid of any attempt to conceal his contempt. She kept eating, her jaw firm, spoon moving quietly against the bowl. The only sound she allowed herself later was the scratch of pencil on paper, darkening contour lines where the valley cinched like a fist in her meticulously detailed map. During a base patrol by the motor pool, 2 special operations operators, their movements fluid and synchronized, strolled past. A few soldiers from Valerius's unit leaned against an armored vehicle, watching her fine-tune a radio. "Dead weight," one announced, as if stating an undeniable fact. "Never seen a pilot scared to fly combat." One of the operators' mouths tugged at the corner. The other exhaled a short, mirthless chuckle. Valerius finished the radio check, logged the serial number, and walked on. The insults had grown from whispers to outright lines, hardening into labels meant to cage her within the pecking order. Meanwhile, the 540-strong battalion pushed deeper into Serpent's Gulch. For a time, the radios ticked with routine traffic, position checks, fuel tallies, route updates. Drone feeds showed convoy dots crawling along a winding dirt path, the heat shimmer warping the view into an abstract painting of their advance. Then, the rhythm cracked. One call never came. Then 2 voices overlapped, frayed at the edges. Someone called for dismounts. Someone else cursed at an engine that wasn't failing. Then came the sound that rips through the soul. The sound you hear once and never mistake. The break in a man's voice when the world ahead explodes. "Contact! Contact!" Static swallowed the rest. Another net cut in. "Taking fire! East Ridge!" A third voice tried to report, then dissolved into ragged breath, a strangled cry. The drone feed bloomed with hot signatures. Muzzle flashes stitched angry, fiery commas across the ridges. Smoke pulsed from the draw. The convoy dots, once moving with purpose, bunched together and froze and snared. Conversations sank into murmurs in the command center. The watch officer slowly lowered his headset, staring at nothing, as if sheer force of will could alter the grim reality on the screen. A lieutenant grabbed a checklist, his fingers fumbling, desperately skimming, but finding no line for this scenario, no protocol for utter chaos. Chairs went still. The room thinned into a soundscape of shallow breaths, clicking cursors, and the low hum of the generator, broken only by one phrase, repeated like a mantra, a shield against the unfolding horror. "Hold position. Wait. Follow protocol." The major articulated it, grateful for the script, for any shred of order. "Too hot. Inside 200 meters. No air support." A captain amplified it, as if louder syllables could somehow transform it into an unassailable law. "Rules are clear. We hold outside the bubble." On a side monitor, a helmet cam feed crawled dust over dry grass. The horizon heaved with desperate, labored breathing. Rounds chewed dirt near unseen boots. Bearings were called, without conviction, without any real hope. Valerius edged closer to the back rail, her eyes glued to a drone angle that just teased the crown of a gun pit on the eastern spur. She counted bursts, mapped the traverse in her head, reading the wind by the way the smoke bent and frayed. Colonel Thorne, his face now etched with a grim tension, asked for options. The major, clinging to the only certainty he had, quoted the manual. "We need them to bound out of the ring, then we can bring steel." His tone made waiting sound like strategy. "They can't bound," a captain admitted quietly, his voice hollow. "Then they hold," the major answered, his grip tight on the line of procedure. The earlier laughter had no place here. Men who had smirked now kept their hands busy, tapping pens, adjusting their watches. Jokes had died, replaced by a nervous, heavy hush. Valerius laid her palm on the worn leather of her flight jacket. The familiar drag steadied her, not from defiance, but from a crystalline clarity that cut through the fear and indecision in the room. On the feed, the eastern gun pit began systematically sweeping bursts down a gully where soldiers clawed low to stay unseen, their forms indistinguishable from the earth. An RPG team in the draw shifted for a clean shot, their knees digging into the soil. "Too hot," the major repeated, his fingers tight on the phrase, as if speaking it enough would make it true. "Nobody's asking for ordnance," Valerius said at last, her voice cutting through the rising murmur. "A cannon pass will do." Colonel Thorne turned, just enough to count as attention, not interest. "We are not authorizing anything that violates the 200-meter rule." Valerius met his gaze, unflinching. "It's not about authorization," she shot back, a rare edge to her voice. "It's geometry. Give me a position and time, and I'll cut their anchors without touching ours." A captain barked a laugh that fell apart halfway through, dissolving into an embarrassed cough. "You'll solve a battalion fight with a cockpit opinion, Captain?" "Stay in your lane," yelled Sergeant Marks from the doorway, the same non-commissioned officer who loved to toss a dismissive nickname into the chorus. Radios made new noises now, flattened syllables from men on the edge of panic. A squad leader, his voice frayed, tried to climb from panic to command and slipped, dissolving into choked static. "Command, this is Bravo. We are pinned. Casualties mounting. We cannot push. We cannot pull back. We need—" The colonel asked for artillery clearance. The answer came late and wrong for the angles, a testament to the chaos. Smoke was offered, then dismissed. The wind would weaponize it against their own. The drone swung, catching just enough of the gun pit on the spur to make Valerius's palms itch, a physical manifestation of her suppressed expertise. Dust coughed from the muzzle, and the traverse ticked like a metronome. She knew the pauses between bursts, the precise, fleeting window a cannon pass needed. With the same calm she used to clear her cockpit, she unzipped her flight kit. The sound was small, a quiet rasp of fabric, but a first sergeant near the door still looked up, ready to shut down any unauthorized movement. By feel, she ran her hand over the throttle quadrant, cycled the cannon check in her mind, and snapped on her gloves. "I can end this," she murmured, not just to the metal, but to the deep-seated muscle memory of obedience that had kept her quiet for months. "Captain, where are you going with that?" the first sergeant barked, defaulting to authority, to procedure. "Out," she answered, her voice low and steady. Before his next protest could land, another call sign broke off mid-sentence, a voice choked with static, punctuated by the sound of desperation. 200-meter rule stands," Colonel Thorne repeated like a prayer, as if saying it would conjure cover, would magically protect them. Nobody moved. Men who had laughed now stared at their hands, finding nothing to say. Officers rearranged procedures on paper, while the monitors kept painting a reality indifferent to their comfort, a reality that defied every neatly penned rule. Valerius slung on her helmet, checked the HUD one last time, and looked from the screen to the door and back again. The angles out there were brutal, yes, but not unsolvable. The distances were nasty, but not beyond what an A-10's GAU-8, deployed in a low, precise run, could fix. One run to cut their anchors, another to widen the lane, a follow pass to keep it clean. No one asked her plan. No one asked anything. The room, paralyzed by doctrine, had decided that waiting was safer than choosing. She'd been patient. She'd been silent. She'd written her doctrine in knee boards no one bothered to read. Now, Serpent's Gulch asked the oldest question, a question of survival, and she already knew the answer. She breathed once, then said, softer this time, "I can end this." They ignored her. Valerius didn't wait. With her helmet tucked under her arm, flight suit zipped to the neck, and jaw set like iron, she moved through the command center like a shadow. Her boots hit the concrete with a rhythm steadier than her pulse, past Humvees crusted in dust, past crates reeking of fuel. The dog tag her father had worn, tucked into her vest, clicked softly against steel with every step, a tiny, almost imperceptible reminder of a different kind of duty. What does it mean to be a leader when the only path forward is to defy those above you? What does it take to step away from the safety of procedure when lives hang in the balance? At the flight line, the A-10 Warthog stood, a beast of function and raw power. Valerius conducted her final checks, pylons secure, cannon harmonics green. She strapped herself into the cockpit, the familiar embrace of the harness a small comfort in the burgeoning tension. This wasn't about glory or rules or vindication. It was about geometry and survival. Spare pylons, ammo bays snug, rangefinder and knee board secured under her thigh. She carried everything she needed, not for some abstract ideal, but for the stark reality of the next few minutes. The climb to her radar/attack stack felt brutal in its own way. Engines spooled up, a guttural roar building in her chest, the canopy fogging slightly with the shift in air temperature. The Warthog tugged at the throttle, eager for flight, as she threaded a low-energy ascent toward the Overwatch ridge. She kept the jet shallow, hugging the terrain like someone who had rehearsed this profile 1,000 times in the quiet theater of her mind. Dust and rotor wash kicked up from the loose talus as she crested into position, rolling into a shallow, hidden orbit. The light was harsh, late morning sun already turning the horizon into a washed-out haze. The cabin was lit only by the ghostly green glow of the instrument panel, reflecting faintly in her visor. From that vantage, Serpent's Gulch read like an open, festering wound. Transports burned, their wrecks smoking black against the pale earth. Columns of pinned soldiers were stalled, barely visible among the rocks. Muzzle flashes stitched angry, chaotic patterns across the ridges, each flicker a silent scream. RPG teams, like predatory insects, hunted for angles between the rocks, their movements precise and deadly. Valerius eased the stick, the subtle resistance of the controls a familiar sensation against her gloved hand. Her world collapsed into sensor and sight, the HUD a vibrant overlay of data on the stark, deadly landscape. She locked onto a gun pit 900 meters out, nestled on a rocky spur. The target box shimmered. The GAU-8's harmonics whispered through the airframe, a deep, thrumming vibration that resonated through her bones as she lined up the pass. Inhale, hold, exhale. A single, surgical cannon burst spat from the Warthog, a controlled explosion of lead. The gunner, an indistinct shape in the crosshairs, crumpled. The weapon went silent. For a breath, the valley seemed to still. The chaotic symphony of battle momentarily paused. What must it have felt like on the ground, that sudden, impossible silence? Then, the radios exploded. "Who's shooting? Do we have air cover?" "Negative. No CAS cleared." Valerius heard the frantic, disbelieving calls, voices raw with fear and confusion. She didn't answer over the net. There was no time for explanations, no space for dialogue. Instead, she slotted a rocket, a precise Maverick-style solution, and rolled for the next target. An RPG team, barely 70 meters from a pinned squad, was setting a tube toward a smoking, armored vehicle. She measured arc and wind drift on the HUD, her mind a blur of calculations, punched off a rocket, and the launcher collapsed into the dirt before the crew could cycle. The screaming net, which had been a cacophony of fear, turned to stunned shouts. "What the hell? Who's covering us?" Valerius offered no reply. She repositioned. A shallow climb, a banked slice designed to keep her signature tight against the ridgeline, melding with the shadow and rock. What would you do in that cockpit, knowing every second counted, knowing you were flying against every order for a chance to save lives that others had already written off? Enemy optics flashed across the opposite lip of the canyon. Tracer glints swept like desperate searchlights, trying to pinpoint her position. Valerius kept the jet low and flat, her breath steady, fingers mapping trim and throttle until the aircraft felt like an extension of her hands, her will. Inch by inch, she worked the geometry. Each pass was surgical, each burst about creating corridors and buying seconds, not about tallying kills. It was about cutting threads, breaking the intricate links that held the ambush together, unraveling the enemy's deadly design. The silence after her first hit was just a breath, but it was a breath that changed everything. Radios exploded. "Who's shooting? Do we have air cover? Negative. No CAS cleared." A command node, tucked precariously into a rock formation, collapsed mid-order as Valerius delivered another surgical burst. A squad of enemy fighters, their tactical cohesion shattered, scattered like startled birds. Moments later,
A machine gunner on the western slope jerked back from his tripod. The line of fire he had meticulously maintained suddenly severed. A squad leader, attempting to rally his men, vanished into a cloud of dust and debris, his momentum sputtering into nothingness. Each pass Valerius made wasn't merely an act of subtraction, removing an enemy threat. It was an act of addition. Each burst bought precious breaths. Each rocket opened vital space. Gaps widened in the enemy's suffocating embrace. Silences lengthened between the bursts of automatic fire. Triggers and cannon bursts, working in concert, bought the pinned soldiers a few more seconds at a time. The kill box, once an impenetrable cage, began to fray at the edges. On the tactical net, confusion flipped into a dawning realization. This isn't artillery. This isn't a drone strike.
This is a gunship.
A raw, almost incredulous voice cut through the chatter. Who's got overwatch? Eyes left. Something's cutting the spurs. Valerius's breathing slowed, her world narrowing to the stark, unforgiving language of geometry, distance, wind, and time. She swung the HUD, calculated lead and harmonics in a blink, and executed without hesitation. Her flight sleeves snagged on jagged metal as she adjusted the cockpit trim, sliding back just enough to reveal the small pilot wings tattoo on her forearm. A tiny warthog silhouette, clear and earned, not decoration. Her scars, thin white lines along her knuckles and forearm, burns that had never fully healed, also caught the light. These were missions inked into skin, experiences that politics had tried to edit out of her record. Now, those silent marks screamed louder than any insult, louder than any dismissal. "Command, do you see this?" A lieutenant's voice, raw with desperation and disbelief, yelled over the ground net. "We've got a ghost on overwatch!" Then a grizzled voice, rough and unmistakable, sliced through the general chaos. Commander Rourke, the special operations lead on the ground, his voice edged with a primal fury, barked a call sign check. "Who the hell's covering us?" Valerius didn't answer on the net. She couldn't, not yet. But someone else did. A comms tech back in the distant command center, his voice hushed and stunned, whispered into his headset. "Ghost Talon 206. The net froze.
A heavy collective silence fell, the kind where everyone listens, every breath held. Rourke's tone shifted, the suspicion melting, replaced by a dawning awe. Wait, Ghost Talon 206, that's Captain Valerius? A beat of stunned disbelief followed, rippling through the command center and out into the valley. No way. Dead weight is Ghost Talon 206? Someone breathed, the old insult now laced with incredulity, stripped of its original contempt. Suddenly, the entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath, because Ghost Talon 206 wasn't a joke. It was a call sign whispered in training rooms, tied to impossible low and slow runs, to uncanny accuracy. A legend formed in the crucible of simulators and forgotten test flights, a legend that politics had tried to sideline, to bury. What would it be like to witness the impossible, performed by someone you had written off? Back in the command room, Colonel Thorne went rigid, staring at the drone feed, at the flicker of a warthog silhouette against the dust. Realization spread over his face like a cold shadow. The support detail no one wanted, the pilot everyone had dismissed, had become the only thread holding the battalion together. The only thing standing between 540 lives and oblivion. Valerius ignored the chatter, kept her hands steady on the stick, her sensors dancing ridge to ridge, tearing open seams where walls of fire had stood moments before. The kill box, once a certain tomb, unraveled into a corridor, the valley shifting from a death trap to an escape route. She never called attention to herself, never demanded credit, just lined up pass after pass, each burst answering months of doubt, years of dismissal. And in that moment, every soldier who had laughed, every sergeant who had dismissed her, every officer who had benched her, watched as Captain Valerius, Ghost Talon 206, rewrote the battlefield, one impossible run at a time. Commander Rourke's voice sliced through the net, confirming the impossible. Ghost Talon? That's Captain Valerius? Back in the command center, Colonel Thorne watched the A-10 silhouette, a chilling realization dawning on his face. What had felt like a coffin hours earlier now shook with rotor thunder. Dust, disturbed by the descending birds, spiraled into choking bone-gray clouds. The first extraction helicopters dropped into the corridor Valerius had carved with her Warthog, their landing lights piercing the haze. Soldiers stumbled and sprinted toward the landing zones, some dragging wounded comrades, others covering with their last precious magazines. Each of them knew the thin, almost invisible line between massacre and miracle was a single pilot, clawing through the ridges in defiance of all odds. Valerius held her orbit low, her cheek pressed against her oxygen mask, eyes fixed through the HUD and the cockpit glass. Every helicopter approach brought new, desperate threats. Muzzle flashes too close to the LZ, a lone fighter sprinting for a desperate final shot, a shifting shadow where none should be. She cut them down with the same cold, patient precision she'd shown in the simulator. Half-second bursts, controlled inputs, calculated risks. Then the radio carried something new. Hope.
First jock is up. Wounded aboard. Second bird inbound. Corridor holding.
Commander Rourke's voice, now steadied by a hard-won victory, declared over the net.
Command, this is Trident Actual. Ghost Talon 206 has us covered. Repeat, Ghost Talon 206 has us covered.
Her call sign raced through the net like an electric current, a conduit for newfound confidence. Voices steadied. Reports came crisp, clear. The fight shifted, no longer about desperate survival, but about efficient extraction.
All units, report accountability,
Rourke ordered, and one by one, squads checked in. At first, gaps yawned, agonizing silences where names should have been. Then slowly, miraculously, those voids filled.
Bravo secured. Charlie accounted for. Delta moving to bird.
When the last leader checked in, Rourke exhaled into the net, a sound that carried the weight of 100 battles.
All 540 accounted for. 0 left behind.
The words landed harder than any gunfire. 0 left behind. An outcome no one in the command post had believed possible just hours before. Valerius didn't celebrate. She cycled through one last scan, sweeping the ridges, tracking each helicopter until the final bird lifted skyward, its silhouette shrinking against the vast, indifferent expanse of the Xylos Badlands. Only then did she ease back, flick the safety on, and release her death grip on the stick. Her hands remained steady, her face unreadable, betraying none of the physical or mental exhaustion that surely weighed upon her. Taxiing back felt impossibly slow, every turn heavy with a fatigue she refused to show. By the time she rolled onto the apron, helicopters were already disgorging battered, relieved soldiers, medics rushing to haul the wounded to waiting vehicles. Dust coated everything in a fine, bone-gray film. But the air carried something new, something profound. Silence. Not the silence of mockery,
but the heavy, resonant silence of respect. Soldiers lined the path along the flight line. No smirks, helmets tucked under arms, eyes locked on her as she climbed down. Men who had once shifted away from her in the mess hall now stood firm, shoulders squared, acknowledging without words, their gazes a silent apology, a profound gratitude. She felt their stares but didn't return them, her helmet tucked under her arm, her boots pressing a quiet, deliberate trail across the concrete. At the far end stood Colonel Thorne, his posture regulation perfect, jaw locked tight. When she stopped before him, the immense weight of the compound, the raw emotion of the rescued, pressed down on the silence between them.
"You disobeyed direct orders," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut, yet laced with an undeniable tremor. Valerius stood at attention, her flight helmet still tucked at her side.
"Yes, sir."
The pause stretched, men around them holding their breath. Then Thorne's voice softened, cracking under something older than doctrine, something akin to awe. "You saved a battalion." The words landed like a verdict. For the first time, his eyes met hers, truly met them. Not her name tape, not her file, not her perceived shortcomings, but her. Before she could answer, Commander Rourke stepped forward. Dust streaked his uniform, grime clinging to his helmet, his eyes bloodshot from hours in the fight. He stopped in front of her, raised his hand in a sharp, almost reverent salute, and held it with the kind of weight that turned a gesture into a monument. "Ghost Talon 206, he said, his voice formal but heavy with a sincerity that resonated through the weary air. "The valley owes you." Behind him, soldiers shifted. Helmets came off, heads bowed. Whispers carried low and reverent. "She carried us. Dead weight saved the battalion." "No," another answered, his voice firm. "Ghost Talon did." The stillness broke into an ovation. Not wild cheering, but the deep, resonant sound of warriors honoring something greater than themselves, something they had witnessed with their own eyes. Boots stomped, hands clapped, voices murmured like a hymn of profound, earned respect. Valerius didn't smile, didn't gloat. She lowered her eyes, a quiet dignity in her stance. "I was just doing my duty, sir." Colonel Thorne nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if the motion itself admitted how profoundly wrong he had been, how deeply his judgment had failed. Commander Rourke dropped his salute and offered his hand. She shook it, her grip steady, the faint white scars on her knuckles visible against his calloused palm. For Valerius, it wasn't vindication, not even relief. It was accuracy. She had done exactly what her training demanded, what her father's lessons had instilled, what her kneeboards had whispered through long, solitary nights. She had seen the geometry, and she had solved it. The ovation followed her as she walked toward the hangar, her father's dog tag tapping against her vest with each step, steady as a heartbeat. Inside, she began her ritual, stripping the Warthog down in her logs, noting fuel burns, cannon bursts, every number in its place. The numbers mattered. The method mattered. Recognition was just noise, a fleeting echo. But outside those walls, something had shifted forever. Soldiers who once mocked her would never again call her dead weight. Officers who dismissed her would never again ignore her hand in a briefing room. The silence that had once carried jeers was now filled with a respect too heavy, too profound to name. And for the battalion, the story would live in the only way stories ever truly survive. retold by those who were there. "We should have died in that valley," they'd say, their voices hushed with memory. But Ghost Talon 206 was watching. True courage doesn't always roar. Often, it waits, quiet, steady, unseen, until the moment it is needed. And when it arrives, it doesn't ask for recognition. It simply does its duty. And in doing so, changes everything. One pilot, overlooked and doubted, refused to let protocol bury 540 souls. Her Warthog rewrote fate, turning a kill box into a corridor of survival. Captain Valerius proved that patience and discipline, honed in silence and scorn, can alter history when courage refuses to stay silent. Her father's dog tag tapping against her vest with each step, steady as a heartbeat, a silent testament to her unwavering conviction.